Gentlemen, today, by popular demand, Big Pretty will take on Jack the Ripper here on Big Pretty Man. Hi, and welcome back to Big Pretty Man, a channel for the extra large man who wants to live his life large and in charge. I'm your host, Timothy Big Pretty Crowe. I'm a wardrobe and lifestyle consultant for the extra large man. Okay, guys, we're going to be doing something a little bit different again. About a month ago, I did a video on Lizzie Borden, explaining how I thought she did it, and also explaining why I thought that she was guilty of the crime. Well, I got a big response on social media. A lot of people asking me questions. Some people wanting to debate it with me, which was kind of fun. But a lot of people noted that I talked about Jack the Ripper and my interest in the case of Jack the Ripper. And they're like, oh, you do a Jack the Ripper video. And I'm like, sure. You know what? This is not that surprising, because since 1888 and the commission of these crimes, the case of Jack the Ripper, or the Whitechapel murder, has fascinated the public. And this has been going on well over 120 years. So, it's not surprising that that someone would request this. And I will say that I have been fascinated myself with the case of Jack the Ripper since I was about 8. I think that's the first time I saw something on television about Jack the Ripper. I think it was actually on In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, and I was fascinated, almost in a ghoulish kind of way, macabre kind of way, which kind of disturbed my parents. But at this point, I have read dozens of books on the case, all the theories on the case, some of them outlandish, of course. I've looked over, the autopsy reports. I've looked over the police reports of the time, the newspaper articles of the time, and also, yes, and in 2019, I did go to, actually both in 2015 and 2019, I went to Whitechapel. In 2015, I looked up the sites myself and walked around. 2019, I actually stayed in Whitechapel, just a few miles from, not even a mile, from where the first victim, Polly Nicols, was murdered, and I took the Jack the Ripper tour. So I think that at this point, I definitely qualify as a ripperologist. So I think I'm a little qualified to talk about this case. Now, as I said, the case of Jack the Ripper holds a fascination for a lot of people. Both amateur sleuths, detectives, the public. It's a fascinating mystery and case. One of the reasons being is that really Jack the Ripper is the first modern serial killer. Of course, there were serial killers in the past, such as Elizabeth Bathory and Bluebeard and others. Really, for the modern age, Jack the Ripper is the first. Now, Jack the Ripper was accused. We know that Jack the Ripper killed at least 5 women, maybe 6. But and for serial killers, in comparison to many of the known serial killers of the last 100 years, that's a rather low number. Not nearly as prolific as, say, Ted Bundy, who we know killed and brutalized 20 women, confirmed, and he claimed 30. Or someone like the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, who actually killed 49 prostitutes that we know of. Or Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed and butchered gay men, about 17 that we know of. Or Andrei Chikatilo, the Russian serial killer, who is known to have killed at least 58 people and butchered and brutalized them. So that makes Jack the Ripper's crime seem rather small. Not that taking any life, of course, is a serious and horrible and tragic incident, but 5 compared to 58. However, one of the reasons Jack the Ripper is so famous is because, one, he is kind of the first, really brutal serial killer, and also he was never caught. That, and that's left a mystery, and people cannot resist a mystery. So now, right out of the gate, let me first say that at this point, 134 years after the crime, the likelihood that we'll ever know who Jack the Ripper truly was is extremely slim to practically none. There was very little physical evidence, really only one piece of physical evidence, back in 1888, and that has long been lost. That would have been the piece of apron that was taken off of Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, that he used to wipe his hands and his knife and threw down into a doorway. That's long gone. That could have revealed some DNA from both Catherine Eddowes and also possibly from him if he accidentally cut himself, as a lot of times people do when they're using a knife. That could have given us a DNA profile that could have been put into a database. That's lost. Even the From Hell letter, by which a piece of tissue from a piece of kidney, which may have come also from Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, was sent along. That is long gone and lost. Today we could actually confirm if that piece of tissue came from Catherine Eddowes. Thus, it would confirm that the letter really was from Jack the Ripper. Lost. So, at this point, all that we can really do, all of us ripologists and detectives and amateur sleuths, is look at the crimes, look at the crime scenes, look at the autopsies reports, you look at the timings of the death, and as well as some of the top suspects of the police back at the time, and extrapolate and speculate from there. And that's really about it. And of course, this has been done hundreds of times, and there is an entire, legion of suspects out there. Some of them quite fantastical and outlandish, such as I've heard the theory it was Jill the Ripper, a female serial killer, or that it was Lewis Carroll who wrote Alice in Wonderland. I even saw one that someone trying to argue that it was the Elephant Man, John Merrick, who was a contemporary and lived in Whitechapel at the time. How does that work? But yes, there's been a lot of crazy theories out there. And I'm not going to stand here and try and say, this man was Jack the Ripper. I can't do that. Nobody can truly do that. But what I can do from my expertise and my now over 40-something years of studying this case is I can eliminate a lot of these suspects, give kind of a profile of who Jack the Ripper was, what kind of man that he was, and what kind of killer that he was, and what kind of motives he had. And I will offer from the evidence from the police reports 2 potential suspects whom I think hold the greatest likelihood out of all the suspects of being Jack the Ripper. And that's about as good as I can do. So to start, let's first look at the time and the place where Jack the Ripper committed these ferocious crimes. That being Whitechapel, which is in the East End of London in 1888. Now, the East End of London was a horrid, maybe one of the worst slum and ghettos in modern history, even compared with those we have today. At that time, London was the economic center of the world, one of the most successful and prestigious cities, on the planet. You can understand, this is in the glory days of the British Empire, with all of the resources and trade and exports that were coming in. However, and of course, it was a fantastic city. But in the East End, it was a overcrowded, filthy slum. It was full of a lot of immigrants, particularly a lot of Jewish immigrants from the pogroms in Russia had drove out a lot of Jews from Russia. If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, those people. And a lot of those people end up going to places like either America or to the UK. And they usually a lot of them settled into the East End of London. It was overcrowded. It was filthy. It was full of a lot of sewage because there wasn't good sanitation at the time. People were living sometimes 9 to 12 people in a room. There was a lot of derelict people, a lot of homeless people wandering around, and even more than that, there was a plague of gin. Gin at the time was equivalent to crack cocaine in the 1980s. It was a very cheap alcohol, a very strong alcohol. Anybody that's drinking gin knows this, and the alcoholic addiction to gin was just rampant, especially in this poverty, overcrowded part of London. People used it for escapism. Many people just basically lived to get enough money, which was gin was pretty cheap, to get this cheap alcohol and spend the day drunk or the nights drunk. Also, because it was such an impoverished area full of indigent people, a lot of women who had lost their husbands either because of their alcoholism or other reasons ended up in Whitechapel, sometimes with children, and they really had little prospects to make money, so they ended up going into prostitution. There's an estimated like 1,200 prostitutes in the quarter mile of where Jack the Ripper did his work, and most of these prostitutes were the shabbiest of type of prostitutes. I hate to make the comparison and use the word, but really they were the 19th century equivalent of what people call crack whores today, or lot lizards. I hate using that term for women, but the image that it conjures is really correct. Most of these women were basically lived kind of homeless. They slept in doss houses, these flop houses that they had to pay like 4 pence a night. For a little less than that, they'd be put in these overcrowded flop houses to spend the night. They usually just try to make enough money to get into one of these flop houses and to get their drink, and that was it. That was their life. And these prostitutes were extremely cheap. Most of them having sexual encounters in doorways, alleyways, that type of thing. And you could buy one of them for 2 pence, 3 pence, or a stale loaf of bread. Yeah. So this was a very, and these were very, very desperate, drunken, and souls that were just wandering drunk and selling their bodies. And actually all of Jack the Ripper's victims, without exception, was women of this type. They were all severe alcoholics. Most of them had been put out by their families, ended up having to prostitute in the streets for their drink and for a place to sleep. Without exception, all of his victims. Now let's go over the crimes, the murders. And classically, there are the 5, what's known as the canonical 5. 5 prostitutes who had been killed and slaughtered between August and November of 1888. Now, they call them the canonical 5 because some people believe that there were more. However, there were 2 other murders just a few weeks before that some people count as Ripper killings. The first one being a woman named Emma Smith, and the second being a woman named Martha Tabrum. However, with Emma Smith, we can pretty much discount that one as a Ripper murder. It doesn't follow the M.O. In fact, she seems to have been attacked by a gang of 3 men. She did survive initially the attack, in which she was robbed. Also, they kind of violated her, actually shoved something up inside of her. And she initially survived, was taken to a hospital, which she died later. But she said that she was attacked by 3 men. So this doesn't, looks like Jack the Ripper likely worked alone. And also did, his thing was mutilation of bodies and cutting throats, and he didn't rob anybody. So it doesn't match his modus operandi. So I do not think that this one, you can count this one out as a Ripper killing. The second one was of a woman named Martha Tabrum, who was stabbed over 40 times. However, there was no mutilation, and looking at the case for Martha Tabrum, her and a friend had picked up 2 soldiers at the time, and she went into an alleyway along with him and didn't come out. And she was found with all these 40 stab wounds. But the knife used looks like it may have been a bayonet. And of course, she was out with these 2 soldiers. They never found these 2 soldiers. Her friend was too drunk to identify anyone. So this also does not look like a Jack the Ripper case. This looks like more like a trick gone bad. So I think that we can kind of discount both of these. Some people have said this, particularly with Tabrum, that this may have been a first exploratory murder by Jack the Ripper, and that is possible, but I'm not thinking so. The situation doesn't fit. So we will go with the canonical 5. First, we'll start off with Mary Ann Polly Nicols. Polly Nicols was a woman that was 43 years old. She had been a servant and got fired from that. She'd also been married and had 5 children, and because of her alcoholism and possibly because of her prostitution to get money for alcoholism, her husband had put her out, and she ended up in the streets of Whitechapel, as one of these street walking alcoholic prostitutes. She was found dead in Bucks Row, which was off Durwood Street, around about 3:40 in the morning. Or she was attacked around 3:40 in the morning, but on August 25th, 1888. So and she was found. It was found that she was. At first, they didn't think she was. The men that found her didn't think she was dead. They thought she was passed out. But then they figured out she was dead. When they took her in, they pulled her dress up. They found that there had been some mutilation, and this mutilation seemed a little more exploratory. It was a bunch of series of deep gashes and cuts, several inches long, on her stomach and abdomen, and also her vagina had been stabbed. And this does look like, almost definitely is a Ripper killing, and it seems like his first exploratory attempts, that he would perfect his grisly MO as the time went on. Now, the second victim of Jack the Ripper was a woman named Annie Chapman. And Annie Chapman was 47 years old at the time of her murder. And her murder took place a few weeks later on September 8th, 1888. Very similar to the rest of the stories. We start to see a pattern. Annie had actually been married to a gentleman who was a coachman, a servant for a lord on a estate in Windsor. And in fact, this early wedding picture is the only existing photo of one of the victims of Jack the Ripper taken while they were alive. There have been several other photos that popped up of some of the other victims, but they have no verification. This is the only verified picture of of a living Jack the Ripper victim. But Annie was a very severe alcoholic. She kept wandering the estate where her husband worked in a drunken stupor, to the point that the lord of the estate said, "We don't want her here anymore." And her husband parted with her, probably because of her alcoholism. And she ended up in Whitechapel with the rest as a derelict, drunken prostitute, street prostitute. Annie was found in 29 Hanbury Street in a small back courtyard. It was early in the morning. She had actually been seen eating a baked potato in a doll's house, but she didn't have her money, so they put her out. And she went out, and she was seen by someone who passing by. She was speaking to a gentleman, and she was heard to say, him to say, "Will you?" And she said yes. She had her hand on his chest, and this is one of the signs of prostitute. They put their hand on your chest and say, "You want the business." So she was apparently making the business. Now, whether this man that this witness passed by and saw was Jack the Ripper, we don't know. It is probably close to time. She was found around 5:30 in the morning. However, someone going to the toilet that day had heard around 5:15 something hit the fence on the other side, and didn't pay much attention. And also about 5 a.m., a gentleman came out the back door and actually sat right down next to where the body was found, and was actually trimming a piece of liver off his shoe, and he saw nothing. So we know that this murder took place probably around 5:15 a.m. in the morning. She was, and in here Jack is beginning to develop his expertise and set up his MO. Her dress had been lifted up. She had been slit from her pelvis, from her vagina all the way up to her sternum bone, spread open. All of her insides, her innards, her intestines had been thrown up over her shoulder. Her uterus had been removed and wasn't found. Obviously, Jack took trophies, and her vagina had been carved out. So she had just been butchered, and she's laying all displayed like this, laying there. And now the third victim was actually a couple of weeks later, on September 30th, 1888, and this was Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was actually about 44 years old when she died, when she was killed. She was actually born in Sweden, and when she came to the UK, she actually had married a gentleman, John Stride, and her original maiden name was Gustafsson, Gustavsdotter, and she then became Elizabeth Stride. And they actually run a coffee shop, and she was said to be very intelligent, speaks several languages. However, things seemed to went wrong with her and her husband. Then he died, and she was out on the streets. And in desperation, she turned once again to drink and to prostitution. And she was actually very frightened about Jack the Ripper. She felt that she was going to be killed by Jack the Ripper. And that turned out to be prophetic. On September 30th, around about 1 a.m., she was attacked in a small entryway into a livery called Duff's Field, which is off Commercial Street. Off Burner Street in just outside of Whitechapel. And interestingly, she was not butchered. She was found with just her throat cut. And it's now believed that Jack the Ripper got interrupted because right around 1 or a few minutes after 1, a gentleman was bringing his cart into that yard. So in other words, he got interrupted. And in fact, his horse shied. It's pitch black. His horse shied, and he got out to see what was causing it. And that's when he found the body. And she was still warm. She had been and bleeding, so she had just been killed. Speculation is now that and she'd also been strangled. So the speculation is now that this Jack the Ripper had made the kill, but he got interrupted and almost caught when this wagon was pulling into the livery, and he took off. Probably took off through the livery and one of the back streets. So this is actually September 30th is what's known as the double event, because within about a mile there was another victim, and that would have been Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes, just like the other ladies, she had a little more of a tragic life. She'd actually her parents had died when she was young. She was actually put into she was an orphan. She spent most of her life in orphan institutions and orphanages. She ended up she never actually married, but she had 2 children. She ended up like the rest. She ended up in the streets, as an alcoholic prostitute. She was about 46 years old when this happened to her, and she was found in Midder Square, which is actually a little far out for Jack, outside of his comfort zone in the quarter mile of Whitechapel. And in this case, she was absolutely slaughtered. Apparently, and if the theory is true that he had Elizabeth Stride, but then got interrupted, apparently he worked himself up from this, and it had to go somewhere. And when he attacked Catherine Eddowes, he like Annie Chapman, he cut her open from her vagina all the way up to her chest, to her sternum, spread her open, pulled all of her insides out, cut out part of her liver, and took part of her kidney, and also took out her uterus and vagina, area, carved that completely out like you would with a deer. He had also slashed her face slashed her across her face, which actually cut off the end of her nose. Her nose actually fell off, and they picked her up. So she was so hideously mangled that they had disfigured, that the only way that her boyfriend could identify her was from a pawn ticket that had been given to her a couple days earlier by a friend for a shirt. That's how they had to identify her. So this shows that Jack most likely was worked up into a frenzy from missing out on his first victim and having been stopped short, and he really took it out on poor Catherine Eddowes. Now, the last known victim of Jack the Ripper took place quite a bit of time later. It was actually because the double event was on September 30th, 1888. This murder took place in November 9th of 1888, and that would have been of Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was the youngest of the victims. She was 25 at that time. We know very little about her because the reason is it's hard to find records because Mary Kelly is a very common name. But from what we do know, she was a very pretty young girl. In fact, she had said that she had worked in a more fancy brothel, and even been taken to France by one of these clients at one time. But either way, something went wrong, and she ended up in Whitechapel. However, she's a little bit different because, unlike the others, the sexual encounters were in the streets. Mary had a room, and that she could take her customers back to. And she was actually seen with a couple of men after leaving a bar by several people. One they said it was a man who looked of Jewish origin features. He had a slouch hat and a long coat, with a fur-trimmed coat, and carrying a package. Also, there was a younger man that she was seen with a fair complexion. She'd been seen with earlier and taken into her house, but she was seen after that, so he's likely not Jack the Ripper. So, but there was the cry of murder was heard sometime around 3 to 3:30 a.m. Most people paid no attention to it, and the next day, the landlord had sent a man around to collect the rent. She was behind her rent and knocked on the door, and he didn't get an answer. However, there was a hole in the glass, and she'd stuffed with rags and newspaper, and he poked that out. He looked inside, and he seen a slaughter scene of nightmares. She had absolutely been butchered and slaughtered like a pig. Now, unlike all the other victims of Jack the Ripper that were these murders were committed outdoors, usually in dark alleys or dark streets, and he's working very fast. It's estimated that it took him between 5 to 10 minutes to do each one of these murders and mutilations. Here, for the first time, he had privacy. He was in a room where he was not likely to be disturbed. And now he could unleash all of his mutilating fetish fantasies on this body. And he definitely did. And as gruesome as it sounds, some people have said that this was Jack's macabre masterpiece. He had skinned her face. He basically flayed her face down to the skull. He cut off her nose, her lips, her eyelids. He'd skinned her cheeks. He'd skinned her forehead. He basically laid the face open. You couldn't even recognize any feature about her. He had, of course, viscerated her as usual, from the sternum bone all the way down to her privates. He had actually cut out and removed her uterus, vagina area completely. He had took out all of her internal organs, pulled them out and put them on a table. He cut the fat off of her sides, cut her breasts off, laid them on a nearby table. And then he had also filleted her thighs right down to the bone. In fact, in this famous crime photo, you can see the femur bone sticking out. So he had absolutely slaughtered and dissected this poor girl's body. And interestingly, this seems to have been his last known victim. There are a few victims or murder victims over the next year or so. One was almost definitely was not him. It was this woman had been out with a gentleman, a sailor. They'd argued, and then she was killed and stabbed, and he was seen later with blood on him. And the other one kind of looks more like a copycat, and a poorly done one. So for whatever reason, this seems to be the last of Jack the Ripper's victims, which is interesting because serial killers do not stop. They don't just suddenly say, oh, well, that's it, I'm done. No, this is usually especially with sexual killers, which Jack the Ripper was, and I'm going to go over that in a minute. But, this is a compulsion that they cannot control. Trying to control that is like people trying to go celibate just for personal reasons. Usually you break down. So eventually he would have broke down, and committed more crimes. So this means that Jack the Ripper was either apprehended for another crime, moved to another area where his crimes were not detected, or he died. That's really the only three alternatives. And what's interesting is within a few weeks of Mary Kelly's murder, the investigation they downstepped the investigation. They took a lot of the beat cops off the walk, and they basically and the case was officially closed about 2 years later. But it's very interesting because they actually stepped down the investigation, stepped down the patrols in a time period that was shorter than between two of the murders. It's almost like the police knew something. And in fact, it almost points to the fact that they thought they knew who Jack the Ripper was, and that for whatever reason, he was no longer a threat. He was no longer going to be doing his murders, which we're going to go into that as well. So those are the famous murders committed by Jack the Ripper in 1888. Now, before we go into the myriad of suspects for Jack the Ripper and discounting and eliminating a lot of those, first let's talk about a profile of the type of man that Jack the Ripper most likely was. Now, today we have professional serial killer profiles, and one was done by a famous FBI agent who actually coined the term for serial killers back in the 90s. And if you're going to have a psychological profile of a serial killer, this is the guy to do it. I've read it, and I absolutely agree with most of his findings. Now, first, let's start off with the famous moniker, the name, Jack the Ripper. What a powerful name! What a perfect name! For a serial killer. And in fact, I think a lot of people feel that name itself has really led to the legend, and the great interest in the mystery of who he was. And interestingly, almost definitely, it's not a name that he came up with himself. The name comes from a letter that was received not long after the Annie Chapman murder, called the Dear Boss letter. It showed up at the Central News Agency, a agency that for journalists used for newspapers in the area, which that itself was very interesting. Most common people would not know about this agency, mostly journalists, which that gives us a hint to the origin. It was written in red ink, in very nice script, kind of teasing about the murders, claiming to have tried to write the letter in blood and several other. You can look it up and read this letter. But he signed it, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Well, this was put in the newspapers, and the name stuck instantly. He became Jack the Ripper. However, it was suspected then by almost every police officer that this was a fake letter. And it was actually believed to, at the time, most likely have been written by a journalist trying to sell papers and stir things up. And now we have evidence that is absolutely true. There was a tabloid type of paper, and they were really hyping on the Jack the Ripper murders, selling papers like hotcakes. But in the Star, there was a gentleman named Frederick Best, a journalist, and it's now believed that he wrote that letter. There was actually a memorandum found by a new editor that took over, scolding the paper for keeping a dishonest man like Best on the payroll, and that he had misled in the Whitechapel murders. How had he misled? So just recently they did a comparison, a handwriting comparison between Frederick Best and the Dear Boss letter, and it fits perfectly. It is absolutely identical match. So there's little doubt now with this memorandum, as well as the handwriting analysis, that this letter was written by Frederick Best to stir up the case. And And one thing about the analysis it showed is that this letter had no life to it. It was just it just was written out. There was no finesse. There was no zest in the writing. And for a serial killer to be writing a note, you would expect that. This looked like it was patiently and meticulously copied. In other words, somebody else had written this down for him, and probably someone else had written the letter and come up with the name, not Frederick Best. The suspicion falls on his editor because Best was protected, and the only person who could protect him was his editor. So most likely the editor had been the one that came up with the name Jack the Ripper, which was a small stroke of macabre brilliance. So, and actually there's a little bit of evidence for that Jack the Ripper disliked this moniker, because there is another letter, the famous From Helm letter, that was sent not to a news agency but to Mr. Lusk. Lusk run a vigilance committee, people out doing night watches trying to catch Jack the Ripper. Big critics of the police at the time. They felt like they weren't doing enough, and he was the leader right in the middle of Whitechapel. He received a small package and letter, and the package was a small piece of kidney, and this is right after the Catherine Eddowes murder. And he was and the letter was claiming this was a piece of her kidney. Now, a piece of her kidney had been taken taken from the body. However, back then, and it was examined, and it was found to have Bright's disease, which was known that Catherine Eddowes suffered from this, from drinking too much gin. However, everybody was gin alcoholics in the East End, so it really doesn't, and Bright's disease was very common, so it really doesn't prove it. Today, if we had it, we could do DNA, and we would know if it come from Catherine Eddowes, from her descendants, and that would tell us the letter is real, but it's been long lost, unfortunately. However, I personally feel that this, I'm about 90% sure this actually came from Jack the Ripper. Why? Because he didn't send it to the police. He didn't send it to the press. He sent it to a vigilance leader in the city itself. And this shows that his concentration was in the slums of the East End, in his neighborhood. And that is a trait that you find among indigent people in cities. They live in a bubble. And out there, and that bubble is their world, and anything outside that bubble does not count. They don't want to think of. You find this today. I've seen this in like, for instance, I live here in Philadelphia, and I work at a museum, and sometimes we have school groups come from some poorer areas, like the North End of Philadelphia, and they'll come to the museum, and these kids will ask. These kids were born and raised in Philadelphia, in one of these neighborhoods, but they'll ask, when are we going back to Philadelphia? When they're right in the center of Philadelphia, less than a mile from the city center. Why? Because to them, Philadelphia is like the 10 square blocks around their house, where their parents never leave, where the people they know never leave. They stay and live in that area, and they even claim, you're from here, you're not from there. So their whole world with these indigent people are within that small bubble. And Jack the Ripper is acting that way. He's not interested in the police. He's not interested in the press. He's interested in the one person he sees as authority in his neighborhood of Whitechapel. This shows that two things, this letter. One, that Jack the Ripper was definitely from that area. He was not some fancy gentleman, and I'm going to go into that in a minute. He was definitely one of these indigent people, working class people, poor people living in that area of Whitechapel, probably less than a couple hundred yards from Dorset Street. And that's one. And number two, this letter he did not sign it. He ended it by saying, "Catch me if you can, Mr. Lusk." So it's unsigned. And this seems to be, and at this time he was known as Jack the Ripper, had been for a couple of weeks. And this is almost like he is rejecting that name. And plus another thing, people's like, well, it's probably a fake. Where do you get a kidney? Even back then, where do you get a woman's kidney? I mean, I guess it's possible from the hospitals, but you can't just go out and give me a woman's part of a woman's kidney. I think most likely this truly was Jack the Ripper's letter, and it's unsigned. Now let's talk about Jack the Ripper's enigmatic appearance. What exactly did Jack the Ripper look like? Well, we will never really know because obviously he wasn't caught. Number one, just like his name, what he really looked like, we don't know. And there were a lot of witnesses to seeing some of these prostitutes with customers in and around the times of the murder within half an hour or so. However, those are very unreliable, even if it was the killer. And number two, these are street prostitutes, and they're approaching a lot of different men and talking to a lot of different men. For instance, we know that Polly Nicols had 3 customers earlier that evening before her murder, and also, as well as Annie Chapman had several customers. So the fact, and a lot of these men they'd approach, they'd talk to, the men would say no, or that it wouldn't work out. And even if they did have an encounter, the encounters usually lasted no more than 15, 20 minutes in an alleyway. So it's really hard to narrow down whether the men these witnesses saw them with was the perpetrator, was Jack the Ripper. However, there are 2 cases of eyewitness. One with Annie Chapman, the man seen putting her hand on his chest not long before the murders, as well as a witness to one of the crimes. That's right, there was one witness, and that was a gentleman named Israel Schwartz. He, a Jewish immigrant who spoke little to no English, who walking down the street saw Elizabeth Stride near that alley being attacked. Looked like she was being strangled and pushed down from behind by a gentleman. The gentleman yelled at him, looked at him, glared at him, yelled at him, actually called him Lipsky. Lipsky had been a Jewish murderer who had been executed a few months before, and since then a lot of people have been yelling Lipsky at Jews as a mockery, and he got afraid and he ran off. But he did get a very clear, well-lit look at the man. And we're going to go into that later. But going from the description from both the person that saw Annie Chapman with the customer with her hand on his chest and Israel Schwartz's description, we get they do correspond. And from what we can take from those 2 witnesses is that Jack the Ripper was probably a man about 5'7". Both said he was about that height, of a worker man's muscular build. Dressed kind of in what is known as the shabby genteel. He had dark hair and a dark mustache. He had kind of a broad face, and they said with darker eyes. Of course, it might be hard to tell. And he wore either a sailor's type of build cap, or a billycock, or my favorite hat, the bowler, like the one I was wearing earlier. Hat, which does fit the profile for a man like Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper. Now, one of the famous images of Jack the Ripper, if you see in the media and you see in movies, is this well-dressed, chap, distinguished gentleman in a cape, in morning wear and wearing a top hat. Forget all that. A man like that would have definitely stood out in the slums and ghettos of East End. Everybody would have noticed him. No, that image actually comes from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That story had been made into a play, which was very popular at the time, and the image of Dr. Jekyll, this well-dressed, distinguished gentleman who was a fiend, and the very real Jack the Ripper who was ravaging the streets at the time, the 2 kind of melded, and over time that's where you get this well-dressed Jack the Ripper. No, Jack the Ripper would have been a very common-looking man, somewhat very unassuming, like a lot of serial killers. If you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't even notice him. Probably very, very unassuming, and probably even very charming, very nice to talk with, which is probably one of the reasons, right in the middle of these murders, that these women, true, they were desperate and go with the best about anyone, but I'm sure their whim was up to someone that looked spooky or weird or creepy. He did not look spooky or creepy, and they didn't seem to have a problem going into dark areas with him. So Jack the Ripper would have been a very common-looking, unassuming, workaday chap walking around Whitechapel, going about his business. A man that would have blended in with the crowd. Now, let's talk about the psychological profile for Jack the Ripper. First off, let's say one thing, that Jack the Ripper almost definitely fits the category of a psychopathic killer. not a sociopathic killer. There is a difference. A lot of times these terms among people are used interchangeably. However, there is a difference. A sociopath is a person who has low conscience. They do have some conscience. They're extremely self-centered. Only they're what counts. Both of these categories are antisocial disorders. But with a sociopath has a lot of problems functioning in society. They usually don't marry. They can't hold relationships. They have trouble holding jobs and homes. These, they often a lot of different legal trouble here and there. Because of their antisocial and disrespect for social rules. So, that's a sociopath. And sociopathic killers, they usually have, everything is for their own means. That's that's usually what you find with sociopathic killers. Sociopaths are actually more likely to be rapist type of killers. However, and there are a couple examples of sociopathic killers, one of which would be Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a man without conscience. In fact, every time he killed, he felt bad about it. He even tried to go to church and repent and all of this. Didn't turn himself in, but he also had trouble holding down jobs, holding down homes. He was a horrible alcoholic. These are all of the traits of a sociopath, and he became a sociopathic killer. Whereas a psychopath is quite different. Now, a psychopath, they have no conscience. They recognize is their own needs and their own desires and fulfilling them. And people to them are just vehicles, just animate objects that to achieve their own motives, whatever those motives would be. And with a psychopathic killer, it is all to satisfy either their fantasies or some sort of need. However, psychopaths, unlike sociopaths, can be very charming. They do understand social rules, and even though they have no real emotions, they're very good at being chameleons and faking emotions and faking social normalities. It's not odd for psychopathic killers to be married, to have children. Usually, these are very shallow relationships, even though their mate may not know this. But they can very well blend in with society, and that is much more the type of man we're looking at with Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, because he won under the radar. He was not someone that the police would have recognized, not someone who had much of a record, if at all. And also, these women, even at the heights of these brutal murders, would go off with him into dark alleyways. And so, apparently, as I said before, he looked unassuming, and he did not look like a threat. Also, he's probably very charming, had probably a nice smile, and he knew how to turn it on and play it as a sexual predator. And while we're on that case, I want to talk about. We can start with one of our first suspects that we can rule out, and one of the most recent ones, and that would be H Holmes. Herman, better known, his true name is Herman Mudgett. Herman Mudgett, H Holmes, was a psychopathic serial killer who lived contemporary at the same time in America. There's some proof that he did travel a little bit to England. He was a very well-off man and a doctor, and he committed at least 9 murders, though he claimed about 200, and there's a lot of legends and things we don't know about H Holmes. And incidentally, I have a little connection to H Holmes. Back a few years ago, one of his great-grandsons believes that he was Jack the Ripper, and that also that he had faked his death, which I find ridiculous. The man was hung in public at Mensing prison here in Philadelphia, and he's actually they buried him in a small town not far from here, just a few miles from here. But because of this, this belief that somehow he had faked his death, got somebody else executed in his place in a prison, whatever, he had the body exhumed. And actually, I knew the archaeologist that exhumed the body. She's a friend of mine, and actually her advisor in forensic anthropology, one of the best in the world. I actually was a student of this lady, and when they brought the remains to the museum where I work, and one of my jobs was to protect the room that it was in, and I have been alone with the remains of H Holmes several times. I've seen them. Spend a little time looking at them. I didn't bother them. I'm not that dumb, but I have. I'm one of the few people that got to spend some time and actually see the remains of H Holmes, America's first serial killer. But anyway, the thing is, we can discount the theory that H Holmes was Jack the Ripper, mostly because of their motives. Both were psychopathic killers, that's apparent. However, the motives are completely different. H Holmes was more economically. He was a psychopathic killer, con man, and he killed people to get their money solely. He would get people to. He would romance women and get them to sign over their inheritance rights, and then they would go missing. He would do fake insurance claims, and then actually kill the person he was going into it with. That's actually how he got caught. He also was apparently killed people in his hotel that he had in Chicago for the Chicago Fair, and he was basically boiling the flesh off and selling the skeletons to medical schools, and they were worth several $100s, which is thousands today. So he was an entrepreneur. He was a serial killer. He was out for the money. In this regard, he's a lot like another psychopathic killer who was from England named John George Haigh. John George Haigh was a very well-dressed, dapper serial killer in the 1940s in England. He was actually charming people, couples, to get money, also older ladies to get their money, and he was killing them, taking their belongings, taking their money, and then he would kill them, and he was boiling he was dissolving them in acid. He was known as the acid bath killer. And when he was caught, he just told this story nonchalant, like it was nothing. He had no conscience about it whatsoever. Never apologized, never felt bad about it. Pure psychopathic killer. H Holmes more follows in that line. Now, Jack the Ripper, his motive was sexual. And now there's no signs that he ever had sex with any of his victims. He just killed them, and then he slaughtered them. And in this regard, what you got to understand is that Jack the Ripper's motive and his reason for killing was not for the thrill of the kill, it was for the dissection and mutilation. That was his fetish. That was his turn on. So as one commentator said, Jack did not cut to kill, he killed to cut. That was his thrill. The killing was incidental. He would kill them usually, and actually usually didn't kill them with a knife. Jack's MO was that usually he'd get them in this place and that he would strangle them. We know that Polly Nicols, Annie Chapman, and Catherine Eddowes, all of them were strangled first, and most likely also Elizabeth Stride. He would strangle them either to death or into unconsciousness. It takes a good 4 minutes to strangle someone completely to death. But he strangled them down into unconsciousness. Then he would cut their throat literally to the spine. And once he'd done that, now he has what he really wants, and that's the material to slaughter. That, and also possibly the thrill of him possibly being caught. That added to the adrenaline, that added to the thrill. But his turn on was slaughter. His turn on was to carve and cut and to rip apart. That gave him a sexual thrill. Very similar to Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a sociopath, not so much a psychopath, but the motives were same for him. Jeffrey Dahmer became sexually aroused only during dissection and cutting up bodies. He hated it, but that was his turn on. In this regard, he's similar to Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper's turn on was the mutilation and slaughter. You especially see that with his last victim of Mary Kelly, where he could have all of his fantasies and he just completely butchered her. So, and serial killers do not, just like people don't change their sexual change what turns them on just suddenly. H Holmes isn't going to go from killing people to get their money, and get them out of the way, to, hey, I want to carve the bodies up and play with the insides. That doesn't happen. So H Holmes, though both are psychopaths, they have two completely different motives, one sexual and one economic. So we can count H Holmes out as Jack the Ripper. As a matter of fact, the one serial killer that is that Jack the Ripper more resembles is actually Andrei Chikatilo, the famous Russian serial killer. And Chikatilo had the same type of of a very similar type of killer fetish. He liked to mutilate bodies. He actually even is picking up. He picked up people from the train stations, desperate people, men, women, children, on the context of prostitute of selling their bodies for prostitution. He'd take them to wooded areas, and apparently he suffered from some forms of erectile dysfunction. And the only way he could really get off, let's just say it, was through murdering the victims. And he bit them, he chewed them, he maybe even eat parts of them, he cut them, he stabbed them, he ripped them open, very similar to Jack the Ripper. In fact, there is no, as I said, there is no proof that Jack the Ripper ever raped or had sex with his victims. And I think, like Chikatilo, he may have had erectile dysfunctions. He may have suffered from at least some form of impotency. However, Chikatilo, very much a psychopathic killer, he had a family, he had a job, he had 2 children. So it could be very likely that Jack the Ripper was the very same. He wasn't this lone fiend wandering the streets looking. He probably had a job, and he probably had a family. We cannot rule that out. So once again, this is the type of killer that Jack the Ripper was. Jack the Ripper killed for the slaughter. He didn't cut to kill; he killed to cut. Okay, so let's now talk about a few more of the suspects, most of which I can completely rule out, and I'll show you why. The first one I'll go over with, other than H Holmes, like I said, we can rule him out. 2 different types of psychopathic killers completely, no links to the crimes. But the other one is the very famous From Hell theory, or the royal family theory, which they've made at least 2 movies about. The one with the famous one with Johnny Depp, and this is a theory that Prince Albert Victor, the son of the Prince of Wales at the time, Edward, who would later become Edward VIII, King of England. So this was Queen Victoria's grandson and heir to the throne, the future King of England. That he had a proclivity for going into the rough here, of slumming. He liked to have sex with low prostitutes, and that each one of these women each knew each other, and that he had actually married in a Catholic ceremony one of these prostitutes, and he'd fathered a child. Now, at the time, one of the stipulations of being the King or Queen of England is that you have to be Protestant, because they are technically the head of the Protestant Church. So one of the rules that came out of the Great Revolution was that the stipulation that they could not marry a Catholic or become a Catholic. So this was a major controversy, a major scandal, and a major problem if this child, who would be an heir to the throne, were to live. So the theory is that this woman was killed, and all of her friends who witnessed the wedding and the marriage, these prostitutes who were all friends, were also hunted down and killed. And the one person that led it up was a gentleman named William Gall, who was actually the royal physician. And they tie this in with Freemasonry. It says it matches a ritual for punishing anyone that talks, by dismembering them and cutting their throat and all of this. And it also tied into a chalk piece of graffiti that was found in one of the crime scenes. Now, when Catherine Eddowes was killed, several blocks away, going back toward Whitechapel, in a doorway, there was found a piece of her apron covered in blood, where Jack the Ripper had cleaned his hands and probably his knife and threw it down. Now, where he threw it down, there was some chalk graffiti that said, basically, the Jews are not the men who will be accused of nothing. So it was an anti-Semitic slur. And actually, the police erased it because they thought it would cause a riot, which was a big controversy. In truth, though, and they say the spelling of Jews is very similar to this Freemasonry way of spelling Jews, Jews, and all of this. I think it's just bad grammar. Also, just like today, if you go to Whitechapel, it's still kind of a slum area, a rough area. You'll find graffiti all over the place like any other city. So this may have not been written by Jack the Ripper at all. In fact, I don't think he had anything to do with it. I don't think he took the time running from a crime scene to sit and chalk something on the wall. I think he just tossed it down, and that just happened to be on the wall. That's my opinion. And this entire theory is complete bullshit. It's a great story. It sold a lot of papers, made a lot of books, several movies, but it has no basis in reality. For number one, we know that Albert Victor was actually probably bisexual, but he seemed to have a preference for men. So, and there is no record of this marriage whatsoever. There is no the Freemasons themselves have rejected any of this. And at the time, Gall had a stroke in 1887, and it really had incapacitated him. And he had a series more, and he died in 1890. So by the time of the famous 1888 murders, he was pretty much a paraplegic. He couldn't walk. Now, they played it up in the movie like he was faking it. He wasn't faking it. The man had a major stroke, and he had several more, and a cerebral hemorrhage, and he finally died. So this whole theory is just pure fantasy. Not a shred of evidence for any of it being true. Pure speculation and pure fantasy. So end of that one. I hear that one the most. Well, wasn't it the royal family? No, it wasn't the royal family, for God's sake. You bringing the royal family into any story will up the papers, will up the popularity. So no, we can discount that one. Now another suspect that's been brought up was a man named Francis Tumblety, who was an American, a very eccentric character. He was kind of a quack doctor, so quack remedies and all of this. He liked to walk around in a uniform that he'd made for himself, big slouch hat, and he had this huge mustache. Just his huge waxed mustache, and he was kind of famous for that. It was known that he had been arrested several times while visiting London. He did visit London very often. In fact, there was a warrant for his arrest when he fled to America, and it was said that he had a lot of had some uteruses and some preserved in jars, and all of that. However, pretty much ruled him out because. One, the way he looked and with his accent, he would have stood out like a sore thumb. He would have stood out. People would have definitely noticed that big mustache and that American accent and the way he dressed. Also, he was a known homosexual, and homosexuality was illegal at the time. All the charges against him, or most of them, were either for fraud or for being inappropriate with a man, and that's one of the reasons he fled. So, and he does not match, there was never any cases in America where he mostly lived, and once again, serial killers don't stop, they just move or die or get arrested. And there's no other murders like that. There's no proclivity for slaughtering bodies. So Tumblety should be eliminated. He was a very weird character, and I think that's the reason they went after him. But, and also usually homosexual serial killers attack other homosexuals. Serial killers usually target the people that they're attracted to, the gender they're attracted to. And, so Tumblety would not have been interested in women. So if he was a serial killer, he'd have been killing men. So you can rule him out. Now, another one is the artist Walter Sickert, excuse me. And Walter Sickert was a rather famous artist, but the only reason for him being associated with these crimes, there's a book written by this, is that he liked to draw some rather macabre prostitute pictures in his art, and it was thought that some of the letters bore his there were a lot of these fake letters being sent in to the police, and some of them looked like they'd been penned by Walter Sickert. If Walter Sickert was guilty of anything, it was maybe faking some of these letters. However, several of the murders, he wasn't in the area at all. There's really nothing to back up him as a suspect at all, other than him drawing creepy pictures. And if that was the case, half the artists in the world would be Jack the Ripper suspects. So forget that. Now, with some of these wilder theories out of the way, let's now talk about some of the suspects from the police at the time, which to me holds a bit more warrant. These are the men that worked the case. And first we'll go over the McNaughton list. Melville McNaughton was one of the commissioners for the Metropolitan Police at the time, and there was a man named Codbush who had become a suspect to one journalist, and this journalist had written to McNaughton, this was in the 1890s, about whether or not Codbush could possibly be it. He said no, absolutely not. He was checked by the police and he was discounted. However, he said, I can give you 3 suspects that more possibly fits being Jack the Ripper. And he named 3 these famous suspects. Now, the first one, and the one he thought really did it, was a man named M.J. Montague Druitt. He listed him as a lawyer, a barrister. He actually wasn't. He was a school teacher, Oxford trained. He taught at a boys' school. And it appears he got fired from this boys' school for some sort of indiscretion. And not long after the Mary Kelly murder, he committed suicide by jumping in the Times. He was actually found several weeks later, after jumping in the Times. And really, McNaughton never really gave a reason why he thought that this man was Jack the Ripper, other than he said he got some information from the family that convinced him that he was Jack the Ripper. Most likely, looking at what happened, he was fired from a boys' school for some sort of indiscretion. He later killed himself. I think that we're looking, can't prove it, but it's pointing toward maybe more like a pedophile type of situation, and he killed himself. And that may have been the information that McNaughton was told, is that he liked boys. Well, that's a sexual deviant. Back then they didn't know anything about psychopaths and psychopathic killers and abnormal behavior. So if he was diddling with boys, then obviously, him being he could just as easily be a serial killer. But there was no connection whatsoever of Druitt. He was never named as a suspect during the investigation. And I think really a lack of information, lack of understanding of these type of serial killers answers why he was a suspect. I don't think he had anything to do with it. Well, also within that note was another suspect that nobody understands why, and there's a man named Michael Allstrom, who was actually a Russian, but he appears to have been a sneak thief and no history of violence. He was a thief. And there's no link, and at one point he was actually incarcerated during one of the murders, so we can rule him out. And the last one ends up being one of the more interesting was a man named Kosminsky. He never said a first name. He said he's a Polish Jew who was likely insane and had a hatred for prostitutes and women. Okay, so, but we didn't know who Kosminsky is, but Kosminsky would become one of interest much later. Okay, with a lot of these fantastical theories now thrown out, let's talk about two of the two best suspects that I feel like have a higher likelihood of being, one of them being Jack the Ripper. First, we'll talk about Kosminsky. Now, this came up in the letter by McNaughton, but later on, one of the other commissioners, Robert Anderson, who was CID for Scotland Yard, who would have been in charge of the day-to-day, all the aspects of the case. He wrote a book later in life called The Lighter Side of My Official Life, basically his autobiography. And in there, he talked about the Jack the Ripper case, and he said that he was not a man that was not known, and that this was not a mystery crime, that they knew who Jack the Ripper was. He said that he was Jewish, a Polish Jew, and that he had that a witness to the crime had identified him, but definitely as the man he saw assaulting one of the victims, and that the man later on was placed in an insane asylum, but he refused to name who it was because he said it served no public interest, which drove all the ripologists insane. It's like, just you went that far, you couldn't say the name. But automatically we knew that this had to have been Israel Schwartz. Israel Schwartz is the only man to have seen one of these victims attacked just a few minutes before the body was found. So he most likely did see Jack the Ripper, and he saw him clearly in good light. So we knew this is most likely Israel Schwartz. Well, in the 1980s, a copy of the book that had been given to the chief inspector, the person right under Anderson, Donald Swanson, who run all the day-to-day investigation in the Jack the Ripper case. He was the man in charge after Anderson. Anderson was actually, throughout most of the case, was actually on a sabbatical, just getting information. So this man was the one that was really running the day-to-day. In his copy of the Anderson book, Swanson had wrote his own notes in pencil. This was found in 1986. It was in possession of one of his grandchildren. And in there, he wrote in that part where Anderson had talked about Jack the Ripper, he said, yes, we did know who it was. And he named the name, Kosminsky, same as McNaughton had named in his list. He said that this man, we did know that he was the killer. He was identified by Israel Schwartz, but Israel Schwartz had refused. He identified him definitely as the man that he saw, and Elizabeth Stride, when he saw her, as the woman that was attacked. So he identified, the only witness identified this Kosminsky as the man he saw attacking Elizabeth Stride, making him most definitely the murderer. However, because they were both Jewish, and the Jews were being heavily persecuted in England and being blamed for the Jack the Ripper as a scapegoat in the area, he refused to give testimony against him. He said that he would not have the death of another Jew on his conscience. Also, he's probably trying to protect the rest of the Jewish population. Now, it had to be something like this for the police, because you understand there was no forensics. They couldn't even type human blood, tell human blood for animal blood. The first fingerprint prosecution wasn't going to come for several more years. So even if they'd have walked upon Jack the Ripper covered, with blood all over the walls, and his fingerprints and blood all over the place, there's no way they connected him forensically to the crime. So, so it had to be something like this: either catch him in the act or a witness. But without the testimony, they couldn't do anything. They had to let Kosminsky go. It said that Kosminsky was let go, but he was watched after that. They knew that this was serious. In their mind, they were convinced that this was Jack the Ripper, and there were no more murders. Eventually, within a year and a half, because it does appear that by that time Kosminsky had dipped deep into schizophrenia. He was in his late 20s, and he did match that profile that I talked about. And he was put into an insane asylum. Now, an exhaustive search of the insane asylums finds only one Kosminsky during that time period. It's a man named Aaron Kosminsky, come from a family, an upholstery family. They built and reupholstered furniture. They were actually a fairly well-off family for that area, and that he had attempted to attack his sister at one point. But that time he had pretty much deteriorated into severe schizophrenia. However, we know from the records that at the time of the murders, he probably was still at least a functioning mind, because he had to go in. He got called into court for having his dog not muzzled, and the testimony he gave and talked there, he seemed very sensible and had it together, and seemed rather charming. Another fit. So the one witness, the fact that the only witness to the crime identified him, that after he was being watched and then placed in an asylum, there were no more killings, and the fact that the police stepped down the investigation within a few weeks after the Mary Kelly murders, says that the police fully believed this was Jack the Ripper, that they had found him and it had been taken care of. They couldn't put him on trial, so so they weren't going to tell the press. So as far as they saw, that crime had been solved. And you know what? As one modern-day detective said, if it's good enough for the investigators at the time who knew the murders, it's good enough for me. And I think Kosminsky is the best suspect, and I think there's a very high probability that he was Jack the Ripper. Now, there is one other suspect that pops up, and that would have actually been one of the men that found the body of the first known victim, Paula Nicols, and he was a man named Charles Allen Cross. Actually, his real name was Charles Allen Ligman, but Lichmere, Charles Allen Lichmere. But he went by Cross, who had been Thomas Cross, his stepfather. What's interesting about this, and then actually a gentleman named Chris, what is his name? Look at my notes here. Christer Helmgen from Sweden. He's the one that came up with this recent theory about Cross, because Cross had claimed that in the newspapers and all this, and in the inquest on the death, that he and another man last name was Robert Paul, found both walking to work early in the morning, found the body laying on the street near Bucks Road. However, an examination shows that's not quite true. That actually Robert Paul walked up on Cross already with the body, even though Cross claimed that they found it about the same time, which is interesting because examining the time when from the inquest testimony, Cross said he left for work at about 3:30 in the morning, and that they both found this body. He found, around 3:45. However, it's only about a 7-minute walk from his house to where he found the body. So unless he stopped and talked to somebody or something, which he did not say, he had at least what's been estimated to be at least 9 minutes alone with this body, and before he saw Robert Paul coming down the alley, and he would have heard him coming because they were hobnail boots on brick. He would have heard him coming. So, and it's interesting because when they got up, they didn't know if the woman was dead, and unlike the other victims, Jack the Ripper almost always put them on display. He hiked their dresses up to show all of the damage that he'd done, the eviscerations he had done. No, her skirt was pulled down, and because the blood was pooling under her and it was a cool night, they didn't know she was dead. And Paul wanted to set the body up, but Cross said, "I'm not touching her." They thought she was just passed out drunk. So they both left to go look for a police officer. They found one about a block away, and it was Litchmere Cross that went and talked to the cop, and he told him there was a lady laying back there on the street. Don't know if she's dead. Don't know if she's just drunk. And there's another police officer with her, and he lied because there had not been another police officer at the scene. And then the cop let him go on, and he went around the corner, and by pure luck, another police constable, another patrolling officer had come along and found the body. And so when this police officer that Litchmere spoke to got there was a cop there. Wonderful stroke of luck, because if he'd have walked up, found that body dead, there would have been an all points bulletin and a manhunt for Litchmere Cross, whatever you want to call him. But there wasn't. So that cop would have had no reason to discount his story. But he was finally fleshed out, and he had to come give testimony. Now so he was alone with the body for a good 9, maybe 10 minutes. Why didn't he mention that? Also, it looked, he would have seen the thing that the dress was pulled down. Did he see Paul coming, knowing he couldn't get away, and straightened her up really quick, pulled the dress down, stood up, and then played it off? Be very much like a psychopathic charming killer. So that is a possibility. This is a man that was found standing over the dead body, and she was still warm. Parts of her were still warm. She had only been dead a few minutes. So it puts him pretty much, he had either the real Jack the Ripper, if it wasn't him, had run off just as he walked up in whatever direction, or he was the one that did it. Also, by another piece of circumstantial evidence, all of the other victims were on a route were along his route, and during the times that he would be going to work, or on his day off, when he'd be going to visit on Saturday, which is when Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes was killed, outside his comfort zone of Whitechapel. This is going getting more towards London. That happened to be where his mother and his daughter lived, and he would have on his day off. That's a heck of a coincidence. That if there was another person that was Jack the Ripper, and Cross just so happened to be available on a Saturday, and just so happened to be in the same area outside of Jack the Ripper's comfort zone in the middle of Whitechapel. I don't believe in coincidences. So, and actually Elizabeth Stride was found like just a few hundred yards from where he used to live. So either this is the most unlucky guy in the world, and every place that he is, Jack the Ripper hits just by coincidence, or he was Jack the Ripper. And but he went under the radar, which would not be uncommon for a charming serial killer. Lived to be into his 70s, actually became a fairly well-off man, and had his picture taken. So this picture of Charles Allen Litchmere, or Cross, you may be actually looking at the face of Jack the Ripper. Well, okay, guys, I know this is a long video, but hey, it's a big subject. I could have done a series on these. But that's all I've got on for this episode about Jack the Ripper. You may note that unlike a lot of the other videos out there or theories out there. I tend to like to stick to what evidence exists, even if it's circumstantial, for any type of conclusion I come up with. You'll notice my two suspects are both. One was a man that was seen and identified as attacking one of the victims, and the other was a man found over the first victim. Those are the two men I think are the most likely suspects to be Jack the Ripper. Number one being Kosminsky, because he was witnessed and identified as a man attacking Elizabeth Stride just minutes before death. And the police at the time were convinced that he was the murderer. And if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. I'm probably 75, I think that'd be right, 75 to 80% sure that Aaron Kosminsky was Jack the Ripper. And if not, I think that Cross is the next most strongest suspect. But either way, that's what I've got, and I give it to you. I try to stay within the lines when I talk about these type of investigations. But this type of thing is one of my passions, just like my study of comparative religion and these gods behind me. So once again, it's good to explore your passions. They're some of the best parts of your life. So definitely you do it as well. Whatever your passion is, go with it with gusto. It doesn't have to make money. It just has to make you happy. And you know what else will make you happy? If you stay pretty.